There is a tree called Quercus alba, white oak, and a tree called northern red oak, Quercus rubra, that many people distinguish as simply red oak, white oak. And they actually are two oaks that fall into two different larger groups of oak trees, the red oak group and the white oak group. And I'm going to try and point out the differences in those groups today and why it's good to know that those groups exist and what the properties, etc. of those groups are. I'm going to go through a couple trees today that are just local to me. There's always going to be the exception in some sort of characteristic, so for what I point out right now is generally the rule, but again, I understand there is always exceptions. But for most on the East Coast, this will apply abroad. So what is before me now is a post oak, Quercus stellata, and it is in the white oak group. And this is somewhat typical of white oak bark for this size tree, and it tends to be lighter in color and flakier or platier than what you will find in a red oak. Red oaks typically have a much tighter bark. Sometimes they're light gray and sometimes they can be very dark to almost black. But for white oaks, typically flaky and lighter in color. The leaves of white oaks versus red oaks. White oaks have rounded lobes without bristly tips, and red oaks have bristly tips, and sometimes they can look lobed, but usually they have sharper lobes. This is an example of a red oak bark, and you'll see that it's a much tighter bark than that of the white oak. And here are some leaves from red oak, and you'll see that the lobes have sharp tips on them. And red oaks will have, hopefully you can see this, a bristly tip. You will not find this bristly tip on a white oak. So here is Quercus alba, white oak, and this is typical bark of white oak. And I'll find you some leaves. The lower leaves on this tree have been hit pretty hard by the insects, so I'll find you an example here momentarily, hopefully. Down here, by the way, you can see the acorns. This is the end of May 2012, and there are still acorns all over the place from the red oaks. We'll talk a little bit about that momentarily. Why weren't all these eaten? But all the white oaks are gone. Here is northern red oak, and you can see the bark, hopefully. Those typical ski trails looking like it's going down the tree, as many people describe it. I saw blackjack oak earlier when I came in earlier, and blackjack oaks look like they have a rounded lobed on their leaves, and this could be a blackjack or a hybridized version. Those in the red oak group tend to hybridize, but hopefully you can see the bristly tip. Even at a distance it looks like it's rounded, but you come up closer on it, and upon inspection you'll see that it does in fact have a bristly tip. That's an indicator of trees in the red oak group. Oh, here's a young white oak, and you'll see that the lobes are rounded on the true white oak, Quercus alba. And you'll find some trees in the white oak group, like chestnut oak, that from a distance look like they may have sharper edges or sharper lobes, but again, upon closer inspection you'll notice that the lobes are in fact rounded. So why is it important to know the difference between the red oak group and the white oak group? Several factors, and the importance will probably depend on what you are and what you're doing, but from a wildlife perspective, the acorn is far more bitter in the red oak group than it is in the white oak group. So wildlife tend to prefer, or I shouldn't say tend to prefer, they do prefer acorns in the white oak group. They're much sweeter. The nutritional value of those in the red oak group from a wildlife perspective is fantastic. In fact, I've read some literature where it's even a little bit better than white oak. But again, wildlife will prefer the sweeter acorn. Also from a wildlife perspective, if you're a hunter as an example, why it might be important to know, other than it is sweeter and preferred, is when they drop. So white oaks drop their acorns in the fall. Red oaks, depending on latitude and species, could drop in summer or fall or anywhere along the line there. So there is a difference. It also takes 2 years for a red oak to make an acorn, where it takes only 1 year for a white oak to make an acorn. So the mast or the crop coming off of a red oak may vary from year to year, where it tends to be more consistent in the white oak group. From a human consumption perspective, it is far easier and tastier to work with acorns in the white oak group. I've never tried them in the red oak group, actually. But in the white oak group, really easy to process, and there's many different ways that you can do it and preferences, and I'll make a video in the fall of 2012 that will show collection of white oak acorns and how I process them in the field, which field processing can have considerations that would be different than dealing with home, potentially, depending on what your resources are. Some other differences between the white oak group and the red oak group would be wood properties. So from a woodcraft perspective, the white oak has the edge. The pores of white oak in the grain have something called tylosis, and tylosis fills those pores, and it creates a more rot-resistant piece of wood. It also has a higher BTU content from a firewood perspective. Firewood is great with both red oak and white oak, but if I had the choice and I'm gonna burn firewood through the night, I'm picking white oak. Cooking over red oak, fantastic. I love cooking over red oak. Also from a wood property perspective, that tylosis, it helps with the rot resistant, but it also makes a more watertight piece of wood. So if you're going to make some sort of container or vessel to hold a liquid, it would be advantageous to do so out of white oak. Where I live and play in Appalachia, baskets are traditionally made out of white oak, not red oak. So there are some advantages. I think I covered it. Just to recap very quickly, red oak typically has a tighter bark. White oak typically has a more flaky bark. The acorns take 1 year to produce on a white oak and are much sweeter and easier to process from a human consumption standpoint. Those in the red oak group are 2 years to make an acorn, and they could drop anywhere from summer to fall depending on location. And then from a wood property perspective, white oak has the edge from a woodcraft perspective as well as firewood. I think that covers it, and you'll see more in the fall when it comes to white oaks and acorns. Thanks and take care.